In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the life of Muhammad. Muhammad was born in AD 570. His family was not wealthy, and his father died before he was even born. After he was born, he went to go live with a Bedouin wet nurse for the first 6 years of his life. This was apparently an Arab custom back then. Shortly after returning home to his mother, she also died. So, now orphaned, he had to be raised by his grandfather. And then, I guess his grandfather died, so he had to go be raised by his uncle. Muhammad's first marriage was to a merchant woman of dignity and wealth named Khadija. There are conflicting traditions about just how old she was when they married. The usual understanding is that she was 40 and he was 25. But there's an equally strong tradition that claims her to have been 28 when they married. And given the fact that she would bear him 6 children over the course of their 10-year marriage, it seems prima facie unlikely that she was 40 years old when they first got married. Whatever the case, Muhammad wouldn't marry again until after she had died. And some would infer from this that Muhammad had a special affection for Khadija. But this may be a somewhat anachronistic way of looking at the life of Muhammad. A lot of our ideas about love are influenced by romance novels, television shows, and Hollywood films. And so, for example, we think that when looking for a spouse, people just need to find their soulmates. And if they do, then couples fall madly in love, they can't bear to be apart from one another, and they remain exclusively devoted to one another and really best friends for the rest of their lives. But that's a relatively modern way of thinking about marriage. Not to say that those kinds of marriages didn't exist in the ancient world. I just think that people tended to marry for reasons that were much more pragmatic and circumstantial. People didn't have the luxury to search for love and romance. They were mainly just trying to survive in a really harsh and inhospitable environment. I mean, 7th century Arabia was not exactly an easy place to live. And we also know that later on, Muhammad would say that Aisha was his favorite wife, and yet he married several women. In fact, he married most of his other wives after he had married Aisha, while she was still alive. So Muhammad doesn't seem to have believed that the special affection that a man has toward his wife needed to be expressed in terms of monogamy. For at least most of the 10 years that Muhammad was married to Khadija, it appears that she was the main breadwinner in the family. And I think that would have given her some significant leverage within the relationship. Because it's one thing for a man to marry multiple wives if he's the one who's supporting them financially. But if it's the wife who's supporting the husband, then that changes things, because she may not feel as amenable to the idea of her having to support not just her husband, but also her husband's other wives. So maybe that was the reason that he didn't marry anyone else until after she had died. In any case, after she had died, Muhammad would marry at least 14 other women and have at least 4 concubines, to say nothing of the other women in his life with whom he had sexual relations. 2 of his marriages were never consummated. In other words, they didn't involve sexual intercourse. Now, according to the Quran, Muslims are only allowed to have 4 wives, but Muhammad said that Allah gave him special permission to marry a lot more than this. This is something that we're told in the 33rd Surah. O Prophet, we. Now, when you see the word we or our, this first person plural in the Quran, that's usually God, Allah, who's speaking. So, O Prophet, we have made lawful to you those of your wives whose dowry you have paid, and those women who came into your possession out of the slave girls granted by Allah, and the daughters of your paternal uncles and paternal aunts, and the daughters of your maternal uncles and maternal aunts who have migrated with you, and a believing woman who gives herself to the Prophet without dowry, and whom he wants to take in marriage, this privilege is for you only, not for the other believers. We know what restrictions we have imposed on the other believers concerning their wives and slave girls. You have been given an exemption so that there may be no hindrance to you, and Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. You are granted the option that you may set aside any of your wives that you please, and keep to yourself any of them whom you please, and call back any of them you have set aside. There is no blame on you in this regard. So here once again, a non-Muslim, a skeptic if you will, might read this and think to himself, this kind of sounds like Muhammad's just making things up so that he can benefit from his position as the prophet. Okay, and as I've already mentioned, Muhammad's favorite wife was Aisha. He married her in his early 50s, and according to multiple ahadith, she was a girl of 6 years old when they married, and 9 years old when the marriage was consummated. This marriage in particular would prove controversial in the modern world, as you can understand. All right, now a little bit about Muhammad's youth. When Muhammad was still an adolescent, before he had received any revelations, a Christian monk named Bahira foretold that he would be a great prophet. And at about age 40, after Muhammad had received his first revelations, he was acknowledged to be a prophet by a certain Waraka. This man was a cousin of Muhammad's wife Khadijah, and he was also a Christian who was something of a local authority in the scriptures. We're told that he would write the Gospels in Hebrew as much as Allah wished him to write. Now that's kind of a strange hadith, because the Gospels were written in Greek. So was Waraka copying the Greek into Hebrew? Or maybe he was copying the Greek into Syriac, and the person who transmitted this hadith just confused Hebrew with Syriac. Who knows? Okay, so he was approved as a prophet right off the bat by his wife and his wife's cousin. But by and large, Muhammad's prophetic status and message would be rejected by Jews and Christians alike, as we'll see. Now, when Muhammad first began to receive revelations, he was deeply troubled. The commencement of the divine inspiration to Allah's messenger was in the form of good, righteous, true dreams in his sleep. He never had a dream, but it came true like bright daylight. He used to go in seclusion into the cave of Hira, where he used to worship Allah alone continuously for many days and nights. He used to take with him, on the journey, food for that stay, and then return to his wife Khadijah to take his food again, similarly, for another period to stay, until suddenly the truth descended upon him while he was in the cave of Hira. The angel came to him in it and asked him to read. The prophet replied, "I do not know how to read." The prophet added, "The angel caught me and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it any more. He then released me and again asked me to read, and I replied, 'I do not know how to read.' Thereupon he caught me again and pressed me a second time till I could not bear it any more. He then released me and again asked me to read, but again I replied, 'I do not know how to read,' or 'What shall I read?' Thereupon he caught me a third time and pressed me and then released me and said, 'Read, in the name of the Lord who has created all that exists, has created man from a clot. Read, and the Lord is the most generous.' Then Allah's messenger returned with the inspiration, his neck muscles twitching with terror until he entered upon Khadijah and said, 'Cover me, cover me.' They covered him until his fear was over, and then he said, 'Oh Khadijah, what is wrong with me?' Then he told her everything that had happened and said, 'I fear that something may happen to me.'" We're told that Muhammad was so disturbed over his experience that he even attempted to commit suicide. Muhammad wasn't sure what sort of spirit was appearing to him. whether it was an angel or a jinn, in other words, a demon. But Khadijah and Waraka encouraged Muhammad and convinced him that all was well and that he was indeed a prophet of God. And there's an interesting story in Ibn Ishaq where we're told that one day Gabriel appeared to Muhammad in Khadijah's presence. Once Khadijah removed her veil, however, Muhammad could no longer see the angel. And from this, Khadijah inferred that Gabriel was definitely an angel and not a Satan, presumably because a Satan would have lingered to lay eyes on Khadijah's exposed face. Okay, now I want to say something here about images of Muhammad. In modern-day Islam, especially among Sunni Muslims, images of Muhammad are usually thought to be forbidden, but this wasn't always the case. In fact, the absolute prohibition against images of Muhammad seems to be a rather recent tradition. Just look at some of these images. Here's one of Muhammad holding the Kaaba stone. And here are some others. Notice that his face was often covered with a white veil. Other times he was depicted as a flame of fire. Here are some other images like that. But look at these images. These are from the 20th century, and Muhammad's face isn't even covered. And then here's another recent picture from Iran. This is Muhammad, although some would say that it's supposed to be Ali, not Muhammad. The prohibition against images of Muhammad seems to have been a mostly Sunni tradition. In Shia and other Islamic sects, such images have been allowed. Well, with encouragement now from his wife Khadijah and his wife's cousin Waraka, Muhammad began preaching the messages that he was receiving from Allah to his fellow tribesmen in Mecca. Since they were polytheistic, he urged them to worship Allah alone. Of special relevance here, an 8th century Islamic historian named al-Zuri claimed that originally the unbelievers of the Quraysh did not oppose Muhammad. Quote, "If he passed by the place where they sat together, they pointed to him and said, 'This young man proclaims a message from heaven.' But they became more hostile after Muhammad, quote, 'began to attack their gods and proclaim that their fathers who died in unbelief were lost to hellfire. Then they began to hate the prophet and to show their hostility to him.'" At this time, when Muhammad still had only a small number of followers, he received the following revelation. "Say, O unbelievers, I do not serve that which you serve, nor do you serve him whom I serve. Nor am I going to serve that which you serve, nor are you going to serve him whom I serve. You shall have your religion, and I shall have my religion." These verses seem to express a spirit of religious pluralism. And in this vein of thought, we should also mention the famous covenant at Aqaba. Some of the earliest converts to Islam took the following pledge of fealty to Muhammad in AD 621. Notably, this pledge mentions nothing about warfare. "We gave allegiance to the apostle that we would associate nothing with God, not steal, not commit fornication, not kill our offspring, not slander our neighbor, not disobey him in what was right. If we fulfilled this, paradise would be ours. And if we committed any of these sins, we should be punished in this world, and this would serve as expiation. If the sin was concealed until the day of resurrection, then it would be for God to decide whether to punish or to forgive." Okay, but this era of religious tolerance wasn't very long-lived. To Muhammad's great disappointment, the Quraysh, Muhammad's own tribe, did not accept his message. They remained committed polytheists. Muhammad continued his preaching, however, and his messages became increasingly polemical as tensions continued to grow between himself and his fellow tribesmen. At this stage, Muhammad received this message from Allah: "Fight them so that there be no more seduction, and the religion is God's." This was when Muhammad introduced the religious concept of jihad. This word means strive or fight. In Islam, it's often understood in a non-violent way. For example, a Muslim might strive to become a better person. But it can also be invoked in political conflicts, in which case it can often encourage or imply acts of a more violent nature. And this is really what Muhammad was starting to encourage among his followers. Now, the Sirah literature explains this shift toward jihad as a self-defense measure. According to Ibn Ishaq, the apostle had not originally been given permission to fight or allowed to shed blood. He had simply been ordered to call men to God and to endure insult and forgive the ignorant. But the Quraysh had persecuted his followers, seducing some from their religion and exiling others from their country. So as things developed, the Muslims had to choose whether to give up their religion, be maltreated at home, or flee the country, some to Abyssinia, others to Medina. When the Quraysh became insolent towards God and rejected his gracious purpose, accused his prophet of lying, and ill-treated and exiled those who served him, he gave permission to his apostle to fight and protect himself against those who wronged them and treated them badly. I have allowed them to fight only because they have been unjustly treated, while their sole offense against others has been that they worship God. When they are in the ascendant, in other words, when they attain political power, they will establish prayer, pay the poor tax, enjoin kindness, and forbid iniquity. All right, now let's talk about Muhammad's famous night journey. One night, the angel Gabriel placed Muhammad on a flying horse called a burak. On this horse, the prophet traveled to, quote, the farthest mosque, which has been interpreted by Muslims as a mosque that was located in Jerusalem. Now, was there a mosque in Jerusalem at that time? Well, it's not impossible, but generally speaking, Islam had not really spread that far north yet. Muhammad also visited hell and witnessed its terrifying punishments. Then he journeyed through the 7 heavens, where he saw Adam in the first heaven, John the Baptist and Jesus in the second, then Joseph, Enoch, Aaron, Moses, and in the 7th heaven, Abraham. Now, according to some versions of the story, Gabriel couldn't take Muhammad any higher than this. He therefore placed him on a flying rug. On this rug, Muhammad flew up into the highest heaven, where he entered the very presence of Allah. And at this point, Allah said to him, "O Muhammad, I take you as a friend, just as I took Abraham as a friend. I am speaking to you just as I spoke face to face with Moses." Right, so why is this night journey so important? Well, it's important for at least 4 reasons. First, this story establishes that Muhammad was of no less authority than Jesus, Abraham, and Moses. It also established Jerusalem as one of Islam's most holy places. Third, the night journey established that prayer was to be offered 5 times a day. This is because, according to the story, Muhammad was first instructed by Allah to have Muslims pray 50 times a day, but when Muhammad descended, he spoke again with Moses in the 6th heaven, and the patriarch urged him to request that the number be reduced. So Muhammad returned to the presence of Allah and got the number reduced to 45. Well, Moses wasn't satisfied with that either. He knew from experience that people weren't going to pray 45 times a day. So Muhammad ascended again and got the number reduced by another 5. And every time that he would descend, Moses would send him right back up to get the number further reduced until finally the number was reduced to just 5. And then the 4th reason that the night journey is significant is because the Quraysh in the city of Mecca made fun of Muhammad's night vision, and this created more social tensions between him and his fellow tribesmen. Now, at about this time, Muhammad was asked by the leaders of a nearby city named Yathrib to come and serve as an impartial leader and arbiter of conflicts within the city. Given the tensions at this point between Muhammad and the Quraysh within the city of Mecca, he decided to accept the job, but only if the city agreed to convert to Islam. It did. So in AD 622, after 13 years of preaching in Mecca, Muhammad made his famous hijrah, that is, his flight or departure from Mecca to Yathrib, a city which would now become known as Medina. And this is a postcard from Algeria that was issued in the 1920s to commemorate the 1300th anniversary of Muhammad's flight from Mecca. Now, a lot of Jews lived in Medina, supposedly. So Muhammad came up with a political agreement or pact with these Jews. It was notable for several reasons. First, it envisioned the Muslim community, known as an ummah, as a single, united, and universal community, comparable perhaps to the Christian concept of the church. Second, it advocated fairness and equality in social dealings. Third, it advocated that Muslims, quote, avenge one another's blood that has been shed in the way of God. Fourth, it spoke of the Jews as, quote, one community with the believers, that is, the Muslims. But despite this pact, Muhammad would find the situation in Medina no less frustrating than the one he had left behind in Mecca. In fact, he seemed to be having even less success with the Jews of Medina than he did with the Quraysh in Mecca. Only one Jewish man named Abdullah accepted Muhammad's message and converted to Islam. The other Jews could not accept that a Gentile, that is, a non-Jew, could fulfill a role similar to, let alone greater than, that of Abraham, Moses, or one of the other Jewish prophets. Well, Muhammad was not happy with this response, so he preached a rather incendiary sermon against the, quote, fraudsters and deniers among the Medinans. Woe to the fraudsters, he said, those who, when they take a measure from people, demand in full, but when they measure or weigh to others, they cheat. Do these not know that they will be resurrected for a tremendous day? The day when humankind will stand before the Lord of the worlds. Woe on that day to the deniers, those who deny the day of reckoning, but none denies it except the sinful aggressor. When our verses are recited to him, he says, legends of the ancients. But no, their hearts have become corroded by what they used to commit. Undoubtedly, on that day, they will be screened from their Lord. Then they will roast in the blaze. Then it will be said, this is what you used to deny. Well, as you can imagine, this sermon did not receive a standing ovation. The Jews of Medina continued to reject Muhammad's teachings. And so we now read in the Quran, why is it that every time a messenger comes to you, speaking about the Jews, with something that you do not like, you become arrogant, rejecting some and killing others? Muhammad wasn't really sure how to respond to this situation. The Jews weren't attacking him, after all, at least not physically, so there wasn't any real justification for him to attack them because Allah had only given him permission to engage in jihad for purposes of self-defense. And forcing the Jews to convert didn't seem like a good approach either. In fact, he received a message from Allah at about this time that expressly forbade forcibly converting someone. In the Quran, chapter 2, verse 256, we read, there is no compulsion in religion. But Muhammad's views were beginning to evolve. Now that he had become a political leader, he became increasingly authoritarian and intolerant toward those with whom he had disagreements or grudges. he decided to settle some of the old scores that he had with the Quraysh. So he organized some attacks or raids on the caravans that were coming in and out of Mecca. This wasn't just a way to exact revenge on the Meccans for the injustice that he and the other Muslims thought that they had endured when they were still living in Mecca. It was also a way for the Muslims to acquire new streams of wealth. One day, Muhammad heard that a Qurayshi caravan carrying great wealth was headed toward Medina. He told his followers, "It is likely that Allah will give it to you as booty." So Muhammad mustered an army of 300 men and began moving in the direction of the caravan. Now the Quraysh had 1,000 men. This is because Muhammad had already raided several smaller caravans, so the Meccans were anticipating another ambush and sent out a significant contingent of armed troops to guard this particular caravan. Well, outnumbered, Muhammad encouraged his men by promising paradise to any who died in the battle. Despite being so vastly outnumbered, the Muslims defeated the Quraysh that day. So Muhammad had now proven himself to be a powerful military leader. This battle afforded Muslims with proof positive that if they acted in accord with Allah's will, they would become uppermost. Yes, the Quran states, if you remain firm and act aright, even if the enemy should rush here on you in hot haste, your Lord will help you with 5,000 angels, making a terrific onslaught. The battle also caused great alarm to non-Muslims, and this is something that's memorialized in the Quran. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. Strike them above their necks, and strike all their fingertips off them. This is because they contended against Allah and His Messenger. If any contend against Allah and His Messenger, Allah is strict in punishment. Here I think we can see a significant shift in Muhammad's teaching about jihad. Jihad is no longer something that's performed in self-defense. Muhammad's main reason for attacking the caravan was to exact revenge for past grievances. And aggressive attacks now seem to be justified on theological grounds. If people are contending against Allah and His Messenger, this is now a sufficient basis for launching a military attack against them. Well, this successful attack on the Qurayshi caravan is highly celebrated. I won't play it here, but you can check out this cartoon that retells the story for young children. All right, not long after this, the Quraysh organized a revenge attack at Mount Uhud, just north of Medina. This time, they would defeat the Muslims. Muhammad attributed this defeat of the Muslims to their inordinate desire for war booty. Meanwhile, Muhammad's relations with the Jews in Medina continued to deteriorate. He suspected that the Jewish tribe of Qaynuqa was now plotting against him, so he had this entire tribe expelled from the city. Now, you might see this as a defensive action on Muhammad's part, but it's entirely preemptive, and this is obviously a slippery slope, since one can now feel justified in taking actions like this if someone or some group is merely suspected of plotting against a Muslim authority. Now, it wasn't long after this that a Jew from the Nadir tribe did actually attempt to assassinate Muhammad. Because of this, he now expelled that tribe from the city as well. Okay, and now we come to another famous battle known as the Battle of the Trench. Muhammad now learned that the Quraysh were planning to launch another attack, this time against Medina itself. So he dug a giant trench around the city. This kept the Quraysh from getting too close, because they were on horseback. But Muhammad learned that a Jewish tribe within the city, named the Qurayza, had broken their pact with him and were conspiring together with the Quraysh. Well, prevented from entering the city by the trench, The Quraysh eventually gave up the battle and returned to Mecca, and this gave Muhammad the opportunity to avenge himself on the traitorous Qurayza. The historical record about this massacre can be found in Ibn Ishaq, who writes the following: "The apostle went to the market of Medina and dug trenches in it. Then he sent for the men of the Qurayza and struck off their heads in those trenches as they were being brought out to him in batches. The death toll, according to Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sa'd, was somewhere between 600 and 700. Well, not long after this, Muhammad raided an oasis at Khaybar, which was inhabited by many of the same Jews whom he had expelled from Medina. He arrived at night, but waited until morning to attack because he wanted to find out if there would be a call to prayer. There wasn't one, so he took this as a justification for attacking. The Muslims were victorious and seized much of the booty and took their women as their wives. Well, after the Muslims had conquered Khaybar, one of the Jewish women from the city offered Muhammad some roasted lamb, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill. But in fact, she had poisoned the meat. And as they were eating, Muhammad cried out, "This bone tells me that it is poisoned." When asked what had inspired her to do such a thing, the woman brought up the fact that Muhammad had just killed her father, uncle, and husband. She also said to herself, "If you're really a prophet, the lamb leg will inform you about it being poisoned. And if it doesn't, then I will have gotten rid of a would-be tyrant." Now, although Muhammad didn't die right away from this poisoning, it did adversely affect his health, and in time, I think after 3 years, he would ultimately succumb to its effects. Well, having proven himself now to be a powerful political leader, Muhammad negotiated a 10-year pact with the Meccans. This pact allowed the Muslims of Medina and elsewhere to make religious pilgrimages to the Black Stone, that is, the Kaaba. Shortly thereafter, this pact was allegedly violated by the Meccans because they attacked a Muslim ally. One could argue, however, that it was actually Muhammad who had first violated this pact because he refused to return a number of women to Mecca after they had come to visit the city of Medina. At any rate, this pact was now dissolved, and Muhammad began making preparations to attack the city of Mecca. He soon marched to the city with a huge army, some 10,000 strong. Many Meccans abandoned hope when they saw this army and went over to the side of the Muslims. Those who resisted Muhammad's entry into the city were overpowered and then summarily executed. With the city now in his control, Muhammad purged the Kaaba shrine of its 360 idols. Here's what the Quran says about this purging of the Kaaba shrine. "Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished away. Lo, falsehood is ever bound to vanish." Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that this Kaaba stone was formerly an object of pagan worship. And it's obvious that even in Muhammad's day, with all of these idols present at the shrine in Mecca, this was still very much a pagan object of worship. According to Muslim tradition, however, it was originally sent by Allah from paradise to earth in the days of Adam and Eve. Adam, they say, used it as the first altar and offered sacrifices on it to Allah. Another story is that it was dedicated by Abraham in order to mark the place where Muslims would circumambulate in honor of Allah. The stone is black, but it's said to have once been pure white. It's been darkened over the years to black because of the sins of all those who have touched it. Now, in view of its supposed sacred origins, the stone is considered to be very sacred. Touching it is thought to be one of the ways that Allah expiates or purges a person of sin. Many Muslims believe that on the Day of Judgment, the stone will come forth and testify in favor of those who have touched it in truth. And I guess what that means is they touched it in faith and with a sincere and pure heart. Well, the Kaaba stone is this little thing here on one of the corners of the Kaaba shrine, which is this big black box. Muslims are expected to travel to Saudi Arabia at least once in their lifetime, preferably during the sacred month of Ramadan, and make a pilgrimage to this Kaaba shrine. And when they do that, they circumambulate. In other words, they walk around in circles around this Kaaba shrine. And as they do, I suppose they pray to Allah and they worship Allah. All right, well, you might be wondering what's inside the shrine. Basically, there are 3 wooden pillars that were supposedly built by one of Muhammad's companions nearly 1,400 years ago. The floor and the walls are covered in mostly white marble. And then on the outside, there are these curtains stitched with the Shahada in Arabic. The Shahada, remember, is the Islamic confession: there is one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Right, so just a little bit more about the Kaaba stone itself. As we saw in this painting, the stone was once square, but at some point it was fragmented. And so it's been glued or cemented back together and placed into this silver framing. The Kaaba shrine has always been a sacred site for Muslims, but now, with the advent of modern transportation, a lot more people are willing to make pilgrimages to it. Just look at these massive crowds. Notice as well that a large amount of architecture has sprung up around the shrine in just the last 100 years. Another important shrine that's located near the Kaaba is the Zamzam well. This is supposedly the well that Abraham's second wife Hagar and her son Ishmael discovered after Abraham led them down to Mecca. This whole story is dependent on an earlier story that can be found in the Bible, in Genesis 21. Here, we're not told that Muhammad led his wife and child down to Mecca. We're just told that he sent them away at the bidding of his wife Sarah. And we're also told that the two were about to die of dehydration, but then God revealed to them a well of water. If you want to learn more about how this well was discovered according to Islamic tradition, check out this hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. Well, with a few more successful battles, Muhammad would conquer the entire Arabian Peninsula, even the cities and territories that were Byzantine or Christian, and Persian or Zoroastrian. He offered these conquered peoples invitations to convert to Islam, but they often refused. Muhammad was therefore instructed by Allah to fight them until they either converted or agreed to pay a tax known as the jizya. At this time, Muhammad received a new revelation from Allah. Fight against those who believe not in Allah, nor in the last day, nor forbid that which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, and those who do not acknowledge the religion of truth among the people of the book, in other words, Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, we've already seen that Muhammad was moving in this direction, especially with the raid on the Quraysh caravan and the taking of Khaybar. But there's not even really an attempt anymore to present this type of jihad as a defensive measure. Islam had now become an offensive and imperialist movement. Right, so what were the consequences of not converting to Islam? Well, any Jews, Christians, or Zoroastrians who refused to convert, as I said, were forced to pay a tax to Muslims. This tax was known as the jizya. These tax-paying non-Muslims were labeled as dhimmis, which means protected persons. They would be protected, quote-unquote, only as long as they continued to pay the tax and conform to certain rules. And even then, they would not enjoy the same status and privileges as Muslims. So this was essentially a war of attrition. Even if they didn't convert at first, over time, many dhimmis would start to feel the social and financial pressures of living under this new form of governance and would convert to Islam. As the quote from the previous slide indicates, the jizya was meant to remind non-Muslims of their subdued status, and it would of course also furnish Muslims with an ongoing stream of revenue, and hence a way to maintain political control. Muhammad led yet another successful raid, this time against the Christians in Tabuk. The Christian troops fled even before he arrived. Then the remaining population agreed either to convert to Islam or to accept their new dhimmi status. Okay, so that's what would happen to Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians if they refused to convert to Islam. But what about polytheists and atheists? What would happen to them? Well, at least those who were living in Arabia were given 4 months either to repent, that is, to convert to Islam, or to leave the peninsula. They were not even granted the option of living as dhimmis, and this would remain the policy after Muhammad died as Muslim armies conquered other pagan territories outside of Arabia. With the pagans of Arabia now either slain or expelled, Muhammad also began to rethink his policy toward the remaining Jews and Christians. As we just saw, they had originally been granted the option of living as dhimmis, but now even this option would be taken away. This is from Sahih Muslim. I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula, and will not leave any but Muslims. During Muhammad's final Hajj visit to Mecca in 632, just months before his death, the Prophet of Islam spoke what is now remembered as his farewell sermon. Some accounts of this sermon are more elaborate than others, but I'll stick here mostly with the early ahadith and the account from Ibn Ishaq. We're told that Muhammad spoke about how Muslims are all brothers, and because of this, no one has the right, for example, to seize another's property. A Muslim's property and land are sacrosanct. He also put a ban on usury, so in Islam you're not allowed to lend money with interest. Muhammad also talked about how husbands and wives have certain rights and certain responsibilities toward one another. If a wife acts indecently, the husband has the right to abandon her in bed and even to strike or beat her, so long as he doesn't leave a mark on her body. The husband also has the right to restrict who it is that his wife allows into his house, and implicitly, who she can be friends with. And then, the wife also has rights. She has the right to be treated kindly with respect to her food and clothing. In other words, the husband is obliged to provide for her in these respects. This is because she's like a captive who can't possess anything for herself. Muhammad also announced that all outstanding blood feuds were to be ended. Now, he wasn't saying that blood feuds were illegitimate and shouldn't ever be pursued in the future, but any feuds, he said, that were presently unresolved were to be forgiven and not pursued any further. Now, the most elaborate version of this sermon is preserved in Al-Jahiz. You can read his version, and you can read some of the other versions of this sermon if you like, by clicking on this Wikipedia article. Well, at the height of his power, and as he was planning to invade the Christian areas of Syria and Palestine, the Prophet of Islam fell ill. He attributed this illness to the poisoning that he had experienced several years earlier at the hands of the Jewish woman in Khaybar. "O Aisha," he said, "I still feel the pain caused by the food that I ate at Khaybar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison." In other words, he's having a hard time breathing. On his deathbed, Muhammad is reported to have put a sheet over his face, and then when he began to feel hot, he would remove it from his face. And while he was in this condition, he made the following statement: "May Allah's curse be upon the Jews and Christians, for they built places of worship at the graves of their prophets." With these words, he was presumably reflecting on how a Jewish woman had poisoned him, and how the Jews had mostly fought against him, as did the Christians. All right, so that's the life of Muhammad. In the next lecture, we'll talk about what happened after Muhammad, and I'll also get into some of the central beliefs and practices of Islam. Thanks for watching.